Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for the pressure as well. And thank you, importantly, for the kind words, Bill. It is, well, first of all, a pleasant good afternoon to you all, and thank you for organizing this wonderful weather here in Monterey. It's certainly great to be here, and I am very grateful for this opportunity to spend a week here at CNS, an organization which has truly set the global standards for non-proliferation, education, and training. Indeed, the Center's contribution to international peace and security through its pioneering work and its long-standing commitment to disarmament and non-proliferation education, Bill, is truly commendable. While this is my first visit to the center, in a very real sense, the CNS was a part of my early training in the field of disarmament and non-proliferation as a UN Disarmament Fellow in 2005. And I'm looking at my lecturer, Mr. Jean Dupree, and I still have my notes from 2005. And preparing to come here, I was quite overwhelmed to see that I have these notes. And as you taught us then, that we should think critically, not just what to think. You were not teaching us what to think, but how to think. And I thank you very much for that. At the outset, I would also like to express my sincere thanks to the indomitable Bill Potter for this wonderful invitation. Bill, I must applaud you for not only successfully pursuing your personal mission of training the next generation of non-proliferation specialists at home here and abroad, but also for working tirelessly to promote greater diversity in nuclear politics. Jamaica's participation for the very first time in the Visiting Fellows program this year, and my own visit here, is further evidence. They are further evidence, I should say, of your tangible efforts to ensure diversity. And so we thank you, and we thank the CNS team here in Monterey, in Washington, D.C., in Vienna, and London for your ongoing work. Simply thank you. Today, I'm very happy to speak to you about the historic treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which you all know, the ban treaty, the nuclear ban treaty. And I will do so from the vantage point of the 14 English-speaking Caribbean countries. They're called CARICOM, the Caribbean community. And in so doing, I'd like to share with you a little about how small states can exert influence beyond their size. As you're all aware, just over a year ago, on the 7th of July in 2017, the majority of the world's nations took a decisive and a major step to rid our world of nuclear weapons by adopting the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. The treaty not only prohibits all nuclear weapon-related activities, but it also sets out measures for disarmament. It addresses victims' assistance, environmental remediation, acknowledges that women must play an equal role in arms reduction, and this disproportionate impact of these weapons on women and indigenous people. It also underlined the importance of peace and disarmament education. So far, 69 states have signed the treaty, 19 have ratified, and once 50 ratifications have been reached, the treaty will enter into force. Now, this treaty is an historic achievement of many years of sustained advocacy and diplomacy by what I call a deaf coalition of governments, intergovernmental organizations, and civil society. And this was done against the odds and in the face of great opposition from the nuclear weapon states and their allies. In fact, some have called this achievement for global diplomacy a revolt, or you should say an uprising by a majority of nations. Now, from the outset, the CARICOM, the Caribbean states, were part of this uprising, and we became actively engaged in efforts to secure a categorical ban on nuclear weapons. And in so doing, we joined other non-nuclear weapon states and civil society actors in what we call taking forward multilateral nuclear disarmament negotiations, which, as many of you may know, have been in a stage of paralysis for over 2 decades. And I hope the students here who are doing the simulation are going to find some strategies for unblocking the paralysis in the disarmament negotiating fora. In looking at the ban treaty from the perspective of the Caribbean states, I'll focus my remarks on two aspects. The first is on the on the why, the genesis, the rationale for the region's active engagement in the process, and then secondly on the how. What was the nature of our participation, given the inherent constraints that small states face in participating in multilateral negotiations? So let's look at CARICOM's participation, the rationale for it. Why did the CARICOM region of small island, and I underline small island developing states, become actively engaged in the ban treaty process? After all, this is not the traditional area for focus. It's usually conventional weapons, small arms in particular. In a nutshell, our decision to become actively engaged in this process can be explained by three interrelated factors. The first is the humanitarian approach to disarmament, and in particular, the renewed focus on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. The second factor would be the region's long-standing commitment and support for a world free of nuclear weapons as state parties to the 1967 Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in Latin America and the Caribbean, which is called the Treaty of Tlatelolco. And the third factor is our desire for action on nuclear disarmament as state parties to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the NPT. Now, in relation to the humanitarian approach, this initiative on nuclear weapons, which shifts the debate on nuclear disarmament from the security dimensions to the humanitarian and environmental impact, resonates strongly with Caribbean states' position. The region has long advocated for a holistic approach to addressing matters of peace and security, recognizing fully the intrinsic link between peace, security, and development. Simply put, we believe that the classical and the relatively narrow concept of peace and security cannot be neatly applied to the multidimensional security threats that confront small island developing states. We therefore view disarmament and arms control from the prism of humanitarian and human security consideration rather than the state-centric posture. For us, disarmament is about people, not the weapons. Human suffering is therefore at the center of our concern. Now, the humanitarian initiative embodies our thinking as it has brought to the fore the unacceptable humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons and the impossibility of any adequate humanitarian response. Like all small island developing states, we view the prospects of a nuclear detonation, whether by design, accident, or negligence, as an existential horror that could decimate the entire Caribbean region. We're therefore deeply concerned about the humanitarian impact and the long-term consequences on public health, food security, social services, infrastructure, environmental assets, and of course the psychological well-being of our citizens. The reality is that nuclear detonation knows no border. We would be disproportionately impacted. For us, prevention is the only option. For what is at stake is the very survival of humanity. We therefore join international efforts to place humanitarian concerns at the forefront of discourse and action on nuclear weapons. Importantly, the humanitarian initiative provided non-nuclear weapon states like the Caribbean states with a platform for demanding that our concerns are placed on equal footing with the security consideration of the nuclear weapon states. The second factor that I mentioned was the Treaty of Tlatelolco. And so we have been, as state parties to this treaty, committed to the goal of a world free of nuclear weapons. The Treaty of Tlatelolco is a pioneering regional prohibition treaty that gave rise to the first nuclear weapon-free zone in a densely populated area. And in a sense, for the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, prohibition is in our DNA. As the Secretary General of the Agency for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in Latin America and the Caribbean, which is called OPANAL, Ambassador Luis Felipe de Macedo Suarez has pointed out, Latin America and the Caribbean brought to world peace and security an inestimable and truly innovative contribution. A space of equivalent to 20 million square kilometers, which is home to about 600 million people, has been kept free of nuclear weapons, and not a single country in the region is party to any military alliance based on nuclear weapons. Now, these are the credentials that have allowed the states of Latin America and the Caribbean community to provide strong political and moral leadership in the ban treaty process. The Humanitarian Initiative has invigorated this long-standing effort of the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, and we are called CELAC as a group, and created a space for us to play a leadership role in developing effective legal measures to attain and also to maintain a world free of nuclear weapons. And we have therefore become actively engaged and more outspoken in debates and initiatives in favor of a world free of nuclear weapons. As state parties to the Treaty of Tlatelolco, we are strongly of the view that there are more rational ways to address the security concerns than to rely on doctrines or so-called strategic stability of nuclear and nuclear deterrence, which are based on the constant threat of mutual annihilation. Our position is also based on the firm conviction that the use or the threat of use of nuclear weapons would be a violation of the Charter of the United Nations, a crime against humanity, and also constitute a violation of international law, including humanitarian law. We also believe that the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons clarifies the legal status of nuclear weapons use and obligation. In so doing, importantly, it will create a much stronger norm against nuclear weapons possession and use, and also stigmatize the weapons and undercut the status that they enjoy, the value, and deterrence roles attached to these weapons. And finally, the third factor I mentioned would be the MPT. We are all state parties, all Caribbean countries are state parties to the MPT, and I would dare say ardent supporters of the treaty. And so we have a keen interest in advancing the goal of general and complete disarmament in pursuit of international peace, security, and development. In this connection, we have been calling for meaningful action on the nuclear disarmament pillar of the MPT. Yet, the nuclear armed states have refused to engage in nuclear disarmament in good faith. And sadly, their refusal has stubbornly persisted for 50 years. Moreover, these states continue to willfully champion a status quo of indefinite possession, which they deem to be in the interest of security and stability. Now the question is, whose security? And what is security? Under this vaunted status quo, we are expected to willingly suspend our disbelief that a heavily armed world can perpetually escape the specter of the use of nuclear weapons. Do we really imagine that given the world's current course, we will forever escape a nuclear catastrophe? In Latin America and the Caribbean, we have a description for such a fantasy. Actually, it's called magical realism. Against this background, we count ourselves among the group of non-nuclear weapon states who are no longer content to accept the status quo in the nuclear disarmament pillar, whereby we continue in a very ritualistic manner to voice our concern, our frustration year after year and fora after fora about the lack of progress on nuclear disarmament pillar, or at the chronic stalemate in the political and the diplomatic levels that impede us in taking forward multilateral nuclear disarmament negotiations. For us, for too long, we have been complicit in maintaining this unacceptable status quo. And so, buoyed by the Humanitarian Initiative, we have joined a majority of non-nuclear weapon states in questioning the nuclear weapon states about their intention to implement their part of the grand bargain, namely to completely eliminate their nuclear arsenals. Now let me turn briefly to the nature of our participation. How are we able to participate given our limited resources? Generally, small states, especially low-income and middle-income economies, have few resources to devote to multilateral fora. We therefore face barrier to participation. We do not have specialist disarmament representatives. And moreover, this is not a high or pressing priority in many of our capitals. As a 2007 study by Dietrich Kapler entitled Diplomacy of Small States, the Role of Diplomats from Small States shows, smallness contributes to a state's diplomatic challenges and it can impact negatively on their effectiveness in negotiations. This reinforces the conceptual framework of small states as peripheral in the international system. And many studies on small island states have also identified a number of inherent and permanent features that are associated with negotiation hindrances due to vulnerability. These include fewer resources, weak institutional structures. We have less information, less specialized staff, as I mentioned earlier, to serve different phases of the negotiations, and the power asymmetries, among other limitations. It has also been generally established in literature that small states are reactive and not proactive. However, despite these inherent challenges of smallness, the Caribbean states, the CARICOM, was very active and often influential player during the band treaty process, including during the deliberations of the open-ended working group on taking forward multilateral negotiations bill that you mentioned, and during the negotiating conference itself. We also participated in 3 international conferences on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, first in Oslo, in Nayarit, and then in Vienna. We sponsored and co-sponsored the various statements and resolutions. We were in several strategy sessions with like-minded states and civil society, and we even hosted one of the first regional roundtables on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. Now, given our limited technical, human, and financial resources, how were we able to participate actively? We did this principally through strategic negotiation planning. Secondly, acting as a cohesive, collective regional bloc, along with the rest of the Latin American states. We did so through advancing functional cooperation, optimizing our limited diplomatic instruments and resources, and forming alliances with other like-minded states within the non-aligned movement, such as Indonesia and Malaysia and South Africa, and with states like Austria, as well as members of the New Agenda Coalition, including New Zealand. Importantly, we were able to draw on the technical work of civil society and academia. Civil society, in particular the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, which, as you are aware, received the Nobel Peace Prize last year for its work, was an invaluable source of research and technical knowledge. As I mentioned earlier, Jamaica hosted one of the first regional roundtables on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. We did this in 2014. And this workshop was organized with ICANN, with the International Red Cross and the Red Crescent Movement, and the International Law and Policy Institute of Norway. And this workshop helped to develop our technical knowledge, to build our awareness throughout the Caribbean region. We also leveraged the experience that we gained in 2014 when we successfully negotiated the Arms Trade Treaty. Allow me to briefly highlight our participation, which Bill did as well, in the second session of the open-ended working group on taking forward multilateral negotiations, in short, the OEWG. And this was held in May 2016. The establishment and deliberation of this working group was quite critical, as it would determine whether a recommendation should be made to the General Assembly to launch negotiations on the ban treaty. By way of background, the Caribbean countries, having co-sponsored the resolution for this working group, which was initiated by Mexico, we were very keen to participate in the deliberations. So we were quite disappointed when it was decided that all 3 sessions of the working group would take place in Geneva, where many small states, including CARICOM states, do not have permanent representation, instead of in New York, where we're all represented. In fact, while Jamaica has a mission in Geneva, it does not follow disarmament issues. However, as I mentioned earlier, the ban treaty process has been about transparency and inclusiveness, and ensuring that all states, large and small, participate in the deliberations. And in this connection, the chair of that working group, who was from Thailand, organized a range for sponsorship program to facilitate the participation of states that did not have permanent missions in Geneva or whose mission needed support. Thanks to this program, Jamaica was able to participate in the second session and was the only CARICOM country able to do so. And I must say I'm particularly proud that I was able to lead Jamaica's actually not lead, I was a one-woman delegation at this meeting. And so I had a chance to speak not only on behalf of CARICOM, but to speak consecutively with the other Latin American states and other small island states. At the OEWG, it was noted that CARICOM, Caribbean states, along with our partner states from Latin America, as well as Samoa, on behalf of the small island Pacific states, were punching above our weight in constructing and shaping the discourse surrounding the rationale for a ban treaty, and of course the elements for such a treaty. What was our strategy? Well, for me, it was about using your voice, active participation, not just observing, to deliver a robust statement on every single item on the agenda. And in particular, not only to just make a case for a prohibition on nuclear weapons, but to identify the potential elements for such a treaty. So we were actively engaged, using our voice, being very prepared to do so. And our preparation was supported by numerous working papers that were prepared in advance. We prepared a working paper, a national position paper, a CARICOM position paper, based on the paper that Latin American and the Caribbean group of nations had put together, based on a working paper that Malaysia had put together, based on a working paper from civil society, and that helped to develop the statements that Jamaica delivered at this session. Also, our alliance with like-minded states and civil society in this session was critical, and for me, to give up sleep for 5 days was a critical part of the strategy. I believe that Bill, in his article on disarmament diplomacy and the nuclear ban treaty, best captures our participation in the OEWG. And he said, and I quote, "Unlike debates at previous MPT and first committee meetings, many of the traditional forceful advocates for disarmament were missing in action. In contrast, representatives from the Caribbean and Latin American states were exceptionally active and often articulate, with as many as 6 or 7 diplomats from different Caribbean and Latin American states taking the floor consecutively and all forcefully arguing for a ban treaty. Indeed, one could have been forgiven for thinking that either Jamaica or Mexico or even Austria was a chair of the non-aligned movement." End of quote. The ambassador of Ireland to the Conference on Disarmament also noted, and I quote, "The broad and brave participation from states, including those less developed states and small states whose voices included many female voices, were so powerful and so necessary at the OEWG in Geneva." End of quote. Caribbean states are proud to play our part in securing international peace, security, and development, and we'll continue to pursue a multilateral and a humanitarian approach for people, planet, and prosperity. I wish to conclude with some thoughts on the way forward. The first is that urgent action is needed on nuclear disarmament, now more than ever. Today, the current security environment is increasingly tense, it's volatile, it's unpredictable, and it's complex. The tensions between nuclear weapon states have reached a new peak in an even more complex and fragile environment than during the Cold War. We are confronted with a new cycle of costly modernization and upgrading of arsenals, development of faster delivery systems, and attempts at modernization to make nuclear weapons easier to use. The vulnerability of nuclear weapon systems to cyber and digital threats is something that needs to be taken into account urgently. It was recently said that we are sleepwalking into a new arms race with no constraints. Against this background, and particularly in the context of rising geopolitical tension, which have also included threats to use nuclear weapons, making progress on nuclear disarmament is clearly more difficult, yet this lends more urgency for action. Disarmament, as the UN Secretary General recently pointed out, remains essential for sustaining non-proliferation. And lack of progress is also very detrimental to achieving the UN 2030 Development Agenda. In going forward, we must now work to ensure the early entry into force of the ban treaty, which gives us a clear pathway and I believe the most practical step towards ridding our world of these indiscriminate and inhumane weapons. In so doing, we must not lose sight of the value of three important elements embodied in the treaty. The first element is the humanitarian approach to disarmament, which I mentioned earlier, has allowed us to put people at the center for action on nuclear disarmament, and in so doing, brought diversity to this field. The humanitarian approach gives us, as the international community of states, large or small, developed or developed, nuclear armed or non-nuclear weapon states, together with civil society, an opportunity to pursue a new and a progressive approach, one that can accelerate our collective effort to rid the world of nuclear weapons. The principles of equality and justice are at the core of this new approach. Moreover, the adoption of the ban treaty has proven that non-nuclear weapon states have a say in nuclear disarmament. Our voices matter. We have agency. And with agency of the non-nuclear weapon states, another fundamental element of democracy has emerged, and that is inclusiveness. The second element that we must not lose sight of is disarmament and non-proliferation education. Bill has long argued that education and training are the most vital but underutilized tools for both non-proliferation and disarmament. And Selina Horry from Peace Boat wrote recently that education is an empowering force, a force that creates knowledge, that builds confidence and breaks down barriers, and importantly, create opportunities never thought possible before. This has been the case of the ban treaty, which recognizes the importance of peace and disarmament education in all its aspects. Education about the impact of nuclear weapons enabled a majority of countries and civil society to reclaim the international agenda to prohibit and stigmatize nuclear weapons. Now, traditional disarmament and non-proliferation have been largely dominated by leaders and politicians, military and scholars. We need to continue to open to a wider audience, including the public at large. And education can do this. Education can give us all a voice in these matters and help to change the complacency and ignorance about nuclear dangers. But we must approach non-proliferation and disarmament education in a comprehensive and in a holistic way, consistent with the approach of not going about it in a silo, to include other educators in other disciplines and other relevant stakeholders. A second element that we must not lose sight of, which is dear to my heart, is gender and disarmament. The humanitarian approach has brought the highly relevant gender perspective to this discourse on taking action on nuclear disarmament. And I am pleased at the inclusion of a stronger perspective on this issue in the ban treaty. Indeed, the treaty acknowledges proportionate impact on women and girls of nuclear weapons. The treaty also recognizes that the equal, full, and effective participation of both women and men is an essential factor for promoting peace and security, and it committed to supporting and strengthening the effective participation of women in nuclear disarmament. I'm truly delighted that an outstanding female diplomat, Ambassador Elaine White Gomez of Costa Rica, played an important role in negotiating the text of the Ban Treaty. A gender perspective questions the ways in which war and weapons are coded with gender norms. The framing of war and violence are strong and masculine is often coupled with a framing of peace and disarmament as weak, feminine, naive, and emotional. Changing these norms can be aided by increasing gender diversity in disarmament. There is also a need for increased efforts to address the underrepresentation of women in the multilateral fora dealing with disarmament and weapons issues. I'm therefore pleased at the efforts being made by the CNS to empower and equip women to participate in this field. I must in this regard commend and congratulate Sarah for her Young Women in Non-Proliferation initiative, which is aimed at bringing WMD non-proliferation and disarmament issues to more women at US colleges and universities, and by doing this, encourage young women to consider careers within this field. I am proud to be a part of this initiative, which was launched earlier this year. My advice to current and prospective female students is, in particular, is to make good use of your training opportunity and exert every effort to use your agency, your voice, to create an alternative view to the state-centric and male-dominated perspective of security issues in your environment. This will be the legacy and the key contribution of your training. In closing, I am compelled to reflect on a question that appears on the homepage of this institute. And the question is, how will you change the world? As a 2005 Disarmament Fellow, I was able to visit Hiroshima and Nagasaki and to hear firsthand the appeal of the A-bomb survivors. Never again. I took their appeal with me, and today I invite you to let us all take their appeal. Let us do our part to rid the world of nuclear weapons, so never again. Let us heed the words of the Jamaican reggae superstar, the late Peter Tosh, when he sang in 1989, "We don't want no nuclear war. With nuclear war, we won't get far." Let us ban nuclear weapons. Thank you for your kind attention.